So, in this time that I have with you, what I want to talk to you about is as an academic, how do you translate and how do you converge to a point where your research matters in terms of societal impact? So, I want to walk you through my own personal journey and provide you some insights of how do you translate research from the lab into the world in terms of societal impact. I'm Dr. Ayanna Howard. I'm Dean of Engineering, College of Engineering at The Ohio State University. And most of the work that I'm going to talk about in terms of the translation occurred while I was a faculty member at Georgia Tech as a faculty member in the School of Electrical and Computer Engineering. And so, just to lay a little bit of kind of grounding of my background. So, I started as a non traditional academic. My first job, my first position was as a research scientist working at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And my role and my goal there was to think about the future of rover navigation for Mars missions. And so, this really started my grounding of thinking about research and the impact of how do we translate the things that we have in our minds, the things that we design, so that it can translate into the real world applications. So, my task at NASA at the time was to think about the future of rover navigation and how do we enable this. And at the time, my approach was to bring in scientists to be part of the team to rethink how we did navigation from the rover perspective because the scientists were the experts. Their objective and their application was why we were designing these rovers was to enable their roles and their goals. And so from very early on, if you think about that, the scientists were the customers. And so if you think about your role as a researcher and engineer, everyone has a customer. Who is it that you're designing for? Why is what you're doing important to the world? That is your customer base. And so, from very early on, as you're designing and thinking about your objective and your research, you always have to have the customer in mind. And the customer could be your program manager at NSF, it could be your students, it could be actual customers in terms of clinicians and therapists or scientists. But when you're designing research, there should be a customer in mind as you're thinking through this. And so I learned that from very early on that there's always a customer, there's always someone who is going to be enabled by or is going to be the beneficiary of your research. And so, what I do, so let me introduce kind of what I do and what I design. I'm a roboticist. What I do and think about is how do we design robotics for engaging with people in the environment? Currently, I think about designing rovers for therapists and clinicians. Prior to that, I thought about how do we design rovers and robotics for enabling science. And so my customer and my human was scientists in general. And so that's how I started. And what I do now is I develop robotics and gamified technologies to engage children with special needs, children with diverse abilities. And so my customer now is clinicians, therapists, parents, children with special needs, as well as the program managers that fund the research. And so when I think about my research and I think about what it is that I need to think about in terms of designing the gadgets and having fun in the lab, my innovation focus is always about this convergence of different stakeholders that have different needs when we're designing the technologies. And so I want to walk you through kind of the transition that I went through as an academic, thinking about this innovation focus from the perspective of designing robotics and gamified technologies for children with special needs. So my system is a robotic assisted therapy system, and it consists of multiple components. So it consists of a gamified therapy apps, it consists of assistive technologies, and it consists of a robot, we'll call it a robot coach, that engages with children in the home in clinical settings to enable a system that provides interventions for children to improve their motor skills primarily. And so each of these components themselves has a story, and I would like to walk you through the story of how, as an academic, this translates to thinking about the stakeholders, thinking about the different types of systems that you have to think about, the types of intellectual prowess that you have to think about in order to enable a system approach to a challenge that, of course, eventually has some type of success. So when I first started off in this field, as traditional academic, I enjoyed doing research. I enjoyed working with my students. I enjoyed doing what I would call toy problems, which basically meant I thought of an idea with my students. We would implement it. We did human subject or human participant studies. We would publish, and that was really how we defined our success criteria. And then what happened was I participated in a program sponsored by NSF called ICOR. And what it required us to do was go out into the field and talk to people who were quote unquote potential customers, potential interested in what we could offer and what we could design. And what that meant was that I talked to individuals that were very into what we were doing, but they were very honest. And so they would say, "Oh, that's a great technology, but it's not going to work for my application." Or they would say, "Well, that's kind of a nice little gadget, but it's useless for what I need in terms of working with my students or working with my patient with respect to children." And so when we participated in this, what I soon realized was that as an academic, we need to redefine what we're thinking about when we're designing research. And at the end of the day, as an engineer, as a computer scientist, I want my stuff used by as many people as possible. It's why when we think about publications and we think about H index, what does that mean? It means that there are enough people out there that have read my paper, that are interested in it, that they're citing it. And so when we're thinking about commercialization, when we're thinking about translating research from the lab to the environment, to society, what we're really thinking about is how many people are interested in what we're doing. And it's a wonderful experience, but it also means that we have to be honest about what our value proposition is when we're designing things. And so we went through this translation. We talked to over 100 individuals. I will tell you the very first number, first 20-ish were, that's cute, but it doesn't work for my target population. It doesn't work for me. And what happened is that we listened in terms of what is it that we are doing and why doesn't it match with what is expected? What is it that we envision and why does it actually correlate to having value to being adopted? And we quickly realized that we had to pivot. And so our very first real world device as an academic, which was translated into a product through a company, was this device that allowed children, clinicians to interact with tablet devices. And so originally what our device was it was a beautiful, beautiful glove that you could wear that used FSR. So it used these sensors that you can interact with that then translated your swipe movements to these tablet-based gestures. And very early on, the kinds of questions we were facing and what we had to address was things like, well, this only works for a very small number of our target population because it requires you to actually dome something on, which of course we didn't think about. We also got inputs such as, well, if I have difficulties with a movement, if I can swipe on your glove, that means that I might can also swipe on a tablet. So why would I need to use your glove? And so what happened was we had this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful glove that was well structured. I mean, it was really nice, but it would translate it to was this device that had a general purpose use. And in the video, you can't even see the device, right? And so as an academic, what happened was we had to rethink and reimagine that sometimes when we're designing devices and sometimes when we're designing technology, it is not our role to be front and center. Sometimes it requires us to have a background role. And our device was basically a plug-in device to different sensors that then interacted with a tablet. And the device itself could sit under a wheelchair. And a lot of times it would sit under a wheelchair, hidden from sight. No one knew it was there, but it was highly functional. And of course, that allowed us by listening to individuals, by listening to the stakeholders, it allowed us to evolve. And then the next stage was, of course, now that we had this device, how do we provide useful content for using it in the field? How do we provide information and scaffolding so that it could be used for the things that we knew that it could be used for in terms of therapy, in terms of education, in terms of working with special education teachers and clinicians and therapists and parents in the home and clinical environment. And so my group, again, we had to reevaluate what we were doing. We went into a whole field of looking at how do we design gamified therapy? How do we incorporate artificial intelligence and machine learning so that these apps could be personalized to the needs of the child? And how can we do this such that it's seamless and we don't have to have an immense amount of data because our children that we interact with, each one has a unique characteristic. And so there's not going to be n of a million. We're only going to have, maximum n of 10. And so again, if you think about this role of convergence research, when you think about our role as engineers and computer scientists in this, it's really thinking about the attributes that all of these different stakeholders bring to the table and taking each of them. And the magic power is figuring out how do you integrate it into a unified system so that the strengths of everything is integrated so that any potential deficits or any potential weaknesses are mitigated for this application. And in this case, it was working with children with special needs in this aspect. The last thing that we did with respect to the device, the original device, which was this beautiful glove that then translated, was also looking at how do we engage with different target demographics. And again, what it involved was us going out, talking to parents, talking to clinicians, talking to therapists, and listening to figure out what was the need and how does their need fit into what it is that I wanted to do. Because we heard a lot of needs in terms of the population, but it didn't fit into me designing and thinking about robotics and AI. And so when we identified and when I heard of a need that I could say, oh, I can think about an AI solution or I can think about a robotic solution to that need, we were able to pivot. And so we did a lot of other things that integrated this aspect of artificial intelligence and robotics and the need in order to bring together this wonderful kind of technology for this target demographic. And where it evolved to, eventually it became a full on product that was adopted by Zyrobotics that translated the research from patents that were filed through Georgia Tech at the time. And of course, what it did is incorporated these gamified technologies, much more of a commercial application, and incorporated the assistive technology device that we had designed in the lab, got it working, did the participant studies to validate it in terms of a research arm. Of course, then it became a full-on product that was validated with customers. And what that meant was that as we listened to individuals, to different stakeholders as an academic, and ensured that our research was designed with the societal impact and the need as its core, when it then translated to the company, it was basically a fairly straightforward process because the company did not have to do that research about the need and the customers. All they had to do was focus on translating it into a product that worked reliably and functionally and in terms of the user interface design. So it was pretty in terms of the customer service aspect and things like that. So I want to talk about my last translation story, which is again focused on this convergence of many different things. So one of the things that we had, if you might recall at the very beginning, there was gamified technologies, there was assistive technologies, and there was the robotic system. The videos that I showed focused on the gamified technology, the translation of that, as well as the translation of the assistive technology device. Now, the robot itself, we wanted to translate. And what we found was that robots are fairly expensive. And the robots that we were using in the lab were beyond basically the buying power of the stakeholders or the customers that we wanted. So our lab environment, our lab robotic systems were in the multiple Ks. And when we talked to clinicians and therapists and parents, clearly the upper echelon of a system being 810K was not doable in terms of out of pocket expenses. And so, again, what we had to then figure out was how do we design technology in the lab that not only works effectively as a robotic system, but also is low cost. And as an academic, a lot of times we don't think about cost. We don't think about that as an aspect of convergence research. But if we want to translate our research into the real world, things about usability, things about cost, things about customer expectation have to be core to how we think about the problems. Because think about it, when we have a solution A and we have a solution B, and we're like, well, they're both equal. If we're thinking about these aspects of usability and cost and expectation, it may actually change our opinion and our thinking process of which solution we should choose at the very beginning. And so what I would say is as you're thinking about your research, as you're thinking about the next design, think about those other things that traditionally we don't think about as academics, because if we think about it at the beginning, it means that we have much more of a higher potential and a higher probability of it being adopted. And so we were very deliberative when we figured out that our standard robotic platform that we were using was not at a price point that could be adopted. We actually thought about how do we design our research, do we design our algorithms around a lower cost platforms that can be enabled, can be still functional, can still work in both the clinic and home environment, but was at a price point that could be adopted. And that also translated into another platform. And this platform was adopted and used in the special education space. It actually was not used for therapy, even though that was our intention, was we're going to design this low cost platform for therapy interventions. But where the adaptation happened and the users that adopted this was in the education space, in the basically the curriculum space for providing accessible curriculum for children with special needs, primarily focused on STEM education. And so this robot, low cost, functional, it incorporated all these aspects in terms of algorithms and engagement with children and learning from them and adapting to them, translated into the education space. Again, by listening to the individuals, by listening to the stakeholders, we were able to translate what we had in the research to have this real societal impact in the space that was useful to someone besides, our students and our participants themselves. And the impact has been well documented. Currently, if you look at the number of customers and users of the gamified technology, as well as assistive technology, as well as the robot itself, it's now it's over 800,000 individuals, primarily in the United States. And so what this means is that as an academic, when we think about the research and we think about the stakeholders and we think about the convergence of different individuals, different ideas, different concepts, and we bring them together, it means that we can have such a larger impact outside of the lab environment, outside of the individual students that we teach and train. We can really ensure that as researchers, we have value beyond the university borders. And I will tell you that kind of return on investment as a researcher, as an academic, is priceless. And so with that, I want to thank you for listening in terms of this talk of the journey between the lab to social impact through this lens of entrepreneurship. Thank you, and hopefully you enjoy the rest of the talks.